When I think about all the worries and concerns of our lives, I will go on record saying I prefer prevention to assistance, that I would rather avoid the problem than to ever face what is hard. It's why we install alarm systems. It's why we buy weather radios. It's why we track our luggage when we travel. We want to avoid the crisis. But like the magician, using sleight of hand, control is an illusion. That even with our best efforts, we cannot avoid everything that is hard. The alarm will fail. The storm will hit. Our luggage will be lost. That we have to face what it is we cannot control. And it's in the wake of what is hard that the psalmist says, I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. And those words are worth tying around our fingers so we do not forget them. That when we cannot prevent or avoid what is hard, we need assistance. Where God will not let our foot be moved. And in the midst of the tug of war of life, as we are pulling and straining and going back and forth, our feet can begin to feel like they are shifting and sliding. And we hold on as long as we can, and we pull as hard as we physically can. But then all of a sudden, we find ourselves lying face down on the ground. That we need to be anchored to something. When I was in the 4th grade at Blue Ridge Elementary School, the last day of class was always field day, where classes compete against one another, whether it was the 40-yard dash or the 3-legged race. And the last event of field day was always the tug of war, where classes faced off against one another. But I was never the tallest, and I was never the strongest. But I was confident in the tug of war because we had Shane, and Shane was our anchor. Shane was big and strong, and he stood at that long line of students there at the end of the rope where he took the rope and he wrapped it around his waist. So if the rest of us temporarily lost our footing or fell down, Shane kept pulling. As the psalmist writes, the Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time on to forevermore. And perhaps that's why Jesus gave that advice to the disciples to pray always and to never lose heart. If we are not careful, though, that can sound like an oversimplification of the problems in our lives. But they are far more than a cross-stitch pattern. There is such tenacity inside those words. If you match those words with a passion for the goodness of those that we love or for the common good. They are far more than trite Pollyanna advice. Jesus shares this parable about a widow, where a widow did not have much protection around her life, that she lived on the margins without much margin for error. And she faced this judge who did not respect others. He had failed to see the connection between divine love and a love for one's neighbor. And she kept going to him saying, "Grant me justice." But he kept griping about a full docket and more demanding cases. And when your voice is deemed small, it is so hard to speak up. Like praying and not losing heart. But she amplified her voice through persistence. And finally, this judge relented, leaving the question on the edge of our lips. If this unjust judge will finally offer assistance, how much more will God anchor us? And this is not about answers to our prayers. It is about the endurance of the widow. It is about the grit of grace. It's about the tenacity of the Spirit. It is about not losing heart, because we can look to the hills from where our help comes. And we have a tendency to underestimate how much we can endure. Rudolf Verbo, who was born Walter Rosenberg, was the first Jewish person to escape from Auschwitz, one of only 4 to ever do so. And when he finally escaped, he tried to warn the rest of the world about the mass murders taking place in the concentration camps, where, upon arrival, 4 out of 5 Jewish people were chosen to be killed. And if you survived, you worked, surrounded by dysentery and fever, the lack of nutrition and food, constant oppression, and immeasurable despair. And he hid in a hole in a construction area at Auschwitz where they were expanding the concentration camp, that he hid in that hole for 72 hours, covered by tobacco that had been soaked in gasoline so the dogs would not smell him. And when he finally escaped, he traveled for days under the cover of night, which is the only way he was safe, until he finally reached freedom. And then he kept trying to convince anyone who would listen of these atrocities taking place in the concentration camps. That how can anyone endure so much? He started hiding on April 7th, 1944. It was the first day of Passover, where the Jewish people were remembering and recalling their liberation from Egypt, their freedom from slavery, and the love of God that anchored them. It is the grit of grace and the tenacity of the Spirit. It is far more than trite advice. It is part mystery, part grace, and part endurance. It is what we mean by faith. Frederick Buechner writes, faith is different from theology because theology is reasoned, systematic, and orderly, whereas faith is disorderly, intermittent, and full of surprises. Faith is homesickness. It is a lump in the throat. It is less a position on something than a movement towards something, less a sure thing than a hunch. Faith is waiting. Faith is journeying through space and through time. And as we journey through space and time, we need the grit of grace and the tenacity of the Spirit as we face what we cannot control. That even though we face insurmountable problems, we continue to move towards the steadfast love of God. Whether we are facing those large-scale problems shared by all of humanity or the challenges found along the landscape of our individual lives, that when we are overwhelmed, we need to remember the people who have demonstrated for us the possibility of endurance, like the widow. Whether we are filled with anxiety because we failed an exam, or whether we are dealing with those nagging worries about other people's opinions, whether we are accepting new limitations in order for us to flourish, or we feel small in the face of daily challenges, or we have lost sight of our meaning and purpose, that whenever we feel like our feet are sliding and shifting beneath our feet, we must remember that we are anchored to the steadfast love of God, which holds us even when we are unsteady. The gospel turns out to be more like a speedboat, more like a tugboat than a speedboat. But nobody dreams of gliding across the water with wind blowing through your hair at a top speed of 17 miles per hour. That's not exciting. A tugboat is not exciting. But as it turns out, that is the speed of the gospel. Just ask the widow. A tugboat is not for show, but it always shows up to care for others. It endures. It is like the grit of grace, which will not let our foot be moved. Amen.